Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. I have recently been reading a little bit of the biography of Stephen Runciman, the famed historian. I'm not quite sure why I decided to plunge into this. As a general principle, I look at biographies as something akin to gossip. And indeed, the first 6 chapters which I have read are pretty much nothing but. However, with chapter 7, we appear to be moving into a different phase of the biography. Stephen Runciman has begun to write, and so the writing is going to be investigated a little bit more thoroughly, be presented more to the fore of his career. But everything prior to that point, it details his student life at, I think, Eton and Cambridge. Well, he's still at Cambridge in this, but it comes down to little more than an inventory of personalities. And it's been interesting in some respects simply because certain personalities whose work I have read or whose works I have read here and there, it turns out were on the scene at the time. So John Maynard Keynes was there. I like Keynes very much, but I didn't know anything about the intellectual milieu whence he sprung or in which he operated. Eric Blair is there, and I think in the same election as Stephen Runciman, if I'm using that word right, the same class as Stephen Runciman, and they were friends. I've read a little bit of Orwell here and there, and it's always interesting to realize where there is some sort of great literary intellectual ferment, that there are some conjunctions which occurred, and I had never been aware of any of this. Student life in these all-boys schools, or what they were in England, does not hold any special interest for me, but nevertheless, I have enjoyed what I have read, and I'm going to read a little bit from you just to give you a sense of the biography itself. This is by Minoo Dinshaw. I believe that would be him. This, of course, is Stephen Runciman himself, photographed by a friend. So I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 6, The Hierophant. And the biography itself is a little bit idiosyncratic. Every chapter begins with the name of a card from the tarot deck, and then a quotation from Arthur Waite, who wrote something called The Key to the Tarot. I'm going to skip that for this, but I'm going to read a couple or a few paragraphs from the beginning of chapter 6. And I should say, this advisor slash teacher that is talked about initially, J.B. Bury, is somebody that for many years I had on my list, I wanted to read. He touched very much on areas that I was curious to learn about. I have a book of his, but the book I have, I believe, is volume 2. And so I was waiting to find volume 1 and never got to it. Then more recently, in the last year or two, I began to read Stephen Runciman, who had been his student, and I realized that there was some overlap. And having read Runciman, it is quite possible that I do not need to read Bury, although I would like to. He has some very interesting titles. So, In 1924, J.B. Bury, a Fellow of Trinity for almost 40 years and Regius Professor of Greek and History for more than 20, was faced with a wearyingly persistent pupil. Having taken an outstanding first, young Runciman expressed his interest in further study within Bury's own field, the Eastern Roman Empire. In A Traveler's Alphabet, his partial memoirs published in 1991, Stephen claimed to have been the only pupil Bury ever had in Cambridge. Quote, Bury was a frail, shy man who many years ago, when he had taught classical history in Dublin, may have had a few pupils. But after he had moved into Byzantine studies, he neither had nor wished to have any. It was an uneasy interview, as I, too, was shy, unquote. And the penultimate sentence is footnoted. At Dublin, Bury had taught at least one pupil who would influence public awareness of Byzantium even more fundamentally than Stephen, W.B. Yeats. I love this kind of anecdote, this kind of ancillary, trivial information. It just helps me to envision the times, the milieu. But let me continue. Stephen was not, in fact, Bury's first pupil at Cambridge to study Eastern Rome. Bury utterly rejected the term Byzantine, arguing instead for an unbroken descent from the Roman Empire. Bury's most gifted earlier disciple, Norman Baines, was, by the time Stephen graduated, already a reader in later Roman history at the University of London. On first meeting the tall, handsome, fresh-faced Bury, Baines took him for a dandiacal fellow undergraduate. As a young don at Cambridge, Stephen would enjoy causing similar confusion. Their shyness once overcome, Bury and Runciman might have seemed well suited. Both were able classicists, omnivorous modern linguists, immaculate dressers, and ceremoniously private beings, drawn to the same esoteric historical and geographical terrain. Friends of Bury remembered him strikingly akin to how Stephen would come to be described, in character distinctive but somewhat elusive, while in conversation, a talk with Bury was almost like being present at the making of history. Stephen was no untried and frivolous undergraduate chancer, but already a star performer. But his brief pupillage under Bury was to be characterized by philosophical irreconcilability and farcical misadventure. As an undergraduate, Bury had been a classicist of practically Haussmannian perfectionism, grasp, and dryness, referring to A.E. Haussmann, the poet who was also a classicist. Quite good. So I understand. At Trinity, Dublin, he had provided much of the legwork for an edition of Euripides, Hippolytus, by the great Professor Mahaffy, now mainly remembered, rather unfairly, as the tutor of Oscar Wilde. Bury won his Cambridge fellowship rummaging in the thorny texts of Pindar. His move to the history faculty at Cambridge signified no softening of discipline. Irritated by Whiggish liberal humanism, Bury advanced instead a rigorously philological Teutonic rival model associated with Leopold von Ranke, which fiercely advocated the release of history from rhetoric. Quote, history is not a branch of literature, Bury had insisted in his 1902 inaugural lecture as Regius Professor just before Stephen was born. He maintained that, quote, so long as history was regarded as an art, the sanctions of truth and accuracy could not be severe, unquote. Nearly 80 years later, Stephen told a young novelist that, quote, history belongs in the English department, it belongs with literature, unquote. The world might have changed out of measure in the interim, but Stephen was still defying the long-dead Bury and his concept of historical science. In his introduction to the 1930 selected essays published in Bury's memory, Harold Temperley wrote that Bury wished to put Clio, the muse of history, in a laboratory before allowing her to declaim in an academy, unquote. Stephen would have found both sentiment and image as ungallant as they were unhelpful. He preferred to think of Clio as an intimate friend with pronounced personal idiosyncrasies, an awful snob. Just to interject, I should say that all of that, Theodore von Ranke and the is history a science or an art question, is dealt with thoroughly and I think correctly by my favorite M.I. Finley in his book, Ancient History, Evidence, and Models, which I have referred to on this channel many times. Let me continue. One more paragraph. According to a traveler's alphabet, Bury conceded a grudging scintilla of admiration during their first desperate-sounding meeting. Quote, he told me firmly that Byzantine studies were far too difficult for any innocent youth to try to undertake, unquote. Perhaps it was understandable of Bury to bristle at the green young pretender intruding on his time and, worse, on his Eastern Roman ground. His next move was to declare that, quote, it was ridiculous for anyone to approach the subject unless he could read the Slavonic languages, unquote. For the great majority of Stephen's contemporaries, this warning would have settled the matter. Even the conscientious and talented Baines had been cowed by a similar test. Quote, from that interview, I retired somewhat dismayed by the prospect of the novitiate which a student of Byzantine history must serve, unquote. Stephen, on the other hand, had experienced a deeper training at the feet of Torby and the charming, mondaine Russian singer Vera Donnet. When Stephen revealed that he read Russian, Bury sent him off to read a few articles in Bulgarian. From this successfully called bluff emerged the Bulgarian slant of Runciman's early research and writing. This was the first example of Runciman's habitual technique, identifying an exotic, unexpected perspective and sticking to it with flair and partiality. I think that's a good description of something that Runciman does in his books. I've read enough of them at this point to have a sense of his authorship. There is interesting footnote on the next page, which I should share with you, because it actually addresses something which I found curious in the first 6 chapters, and I was glad that he ultimately made an acknowledgement of it in this footnote. This book alludes to Stephen when discussing Stephen Runciman as a biographical subject, partly to distinguish him from members of his family prominent in his story, partly to approach more nearly his mentality and that of his friends. By a similar principle, other personages are called by the names Stephen would have used of them, and Stephen himself becomes Runciman when his writing and historiographical thought is under discussion. So I am thoroughly enjoying it, even though it has been very much gossip so far. But as I say, chapter 7, which gives us the Sun card, is getting into his writing. And I thought I would read you the first sentence of that chapter, just because it gives you a sense of some of the idiosyncratic nature of this book. Cambridge is proverbially a dampening place, and Stephen was a believer in human photosynthesis. And the other quote at the beginning of this is a famous one by Dorothy Parker. I won't read it to you, but if you got a clear view of the page when I held it up, you could see it. So it's, I don't know what place Dorothy Parker has or the tarot has in this, but obviously all of that was around at the time. All of William Butler Yeats's, now I can't remember what it is, contacting of spirits and so forth, that was in the air. So such things are mentioned. I don't know if William Butler Yeats is mentioned again. Let me see. Some other poems are noted. Oh, and Stephen Runciman meets him on page 187 and page 464. So I have that to look forward to. So this is fun in a gossipy sort of way. It is funny how when one is predisposed to an author, one accepts things that one would not tolerate in another author. So I recall when I recently read A Boy's Own Story, I criticized him because it was insofar as it is a memoir. It's classed as an autobiographical novel, but it reads like a memoir. That he comes from something of an affluent background and has nothing much to bring in terms of introspection to his situation. Runciman, of course, was beyond affluent. I know enough about Runciman's biography in the sketchy overview, I guess. He is beyond the pale when it comes to his family origins, but I have no criticisms for him. I've been reading recently also the Stonewall Reader. This is drawing from the New York Public Library's archives, and it's individual persons who were on the scene at the time before and after the Stonewall uprising with their personal recollections, more or less. And I have found it marvelous reading in a time when members of what I guess we are calling now the LGBTQIA community are being persecuted by our government and by large segments of this society, the so-called Christian fascists. And I am finding that every single entry in this book so far has been a home run. I've read a couple of pieces here and there, but I realize I cannot read the whole book. But I can't speak highly enough of this. Of course, Stephen Runciman is known to have been gay as well, and it is unclear as yet to what extent that will be covered in this biography. That, of course, is probably lending credence to my view of biography as being somewhat gossipy. Mind you, gossip does not have to be untrue. It does not have to be salacious. Gossip can just be utterly factual. It is just people talking about people. And so in this case, because I like Stephen Runciman, I am happy to find out more. I am happy to find out about Eric Blair, better known as George Orwell. Aldous Huxley is there, as I said, John Maynard Keynes, a lot of different prominent names that I have come across in my life as a wannabe reader. I've always wanted to be an educated person, and one comes across these things, but I have never really had any sense of the university milieu or the private boys' school milieu in England or in, indeed, the United Kingdom, as it were. And it's not something that I particularly want to enmesh myself in intellectually. But for the time being, I am persisting with these books. I am reading a little bit of Han Shan as well. And we'll see how far it goes. My best laid schemes from the beginning of the year have been cast aside. I don't know if I will get back to them, but I feel it is better to be doing a little something rather than just letting everything go to pot, even though our country seems to be doing so. So I will leave off there. Remember, we should all be seeking to abolish ICE, these terrible human beings that work for ICE should be made to face consequences for all their heinous deeds. So if you see anything, please be sure to document it. Take out your camera and film them, etc., etc. The fascist regime in power in the United States is less secure than they want you to think. And if we keep chipping away at them, we may see them fall, and then we must make sure that these malefactors, these actors, are brought to justice across the board, not just those at the highest levels, but all of these persons who are masking themselves and just committing great crimes against humanity. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.